The Learning System. Narrated presentation by Montana Rose Aguele de Guerrero. Student ID 16064332. In this video, I will be reading one of my own anecdotes, then analysing it with educational theory. Let's begin. In 9, I had a maths teacher who used to pick on me, called Mr. Raven. By this, I mean he would actively attempt to pick me out from a room full of people with hands up to answer a question he was fully aware I did not know the answer to. He would openly laugh at me. I started to skip maths classes for fear of being ridiculed by him, reinforcing my already poor knowledge of the subject. The entire year he made me feel like a failure, and so you can understand why I started to feel anxious at the start of year 10 with the prospect of a new teacher. As I entered the year 10 maths classroom to see Mr. Cork at the front of the classroom next to his name on the board, Mr. Cork placed a popsicle stick on the desk in front of each of us and instructed us to write our names down on them. He collected the sticks and put them into a pot on his desk. Whenever a question would be asked, rather than putting hands up to answer it, whoever's name was picked out of the jar would have to go through the problem on the board and explain to the class how they would achieve their given answer. If the student didn't understand, Mr. Cork would help them through questioning until they could come to the answer. While I accept this was not a radical technique, I felt the effects of it in a few weeks. For a start, I was no longer being picked on to answer questions. So, when my name did come up, I did not feel personally targeted. I no longer felt stupid when I did not know the answer, since, firstly, I began to realize lots of other students didn't know the answers, which I hadn't realized the year before because they weren't forced to admit their ignorance every lesson like me. Secondly, because I knew, even when I didn't know the answer, Mr. Cork would eventually help me to get there, rather than leaving me floundering for the knowledge on my own. I felt so encouraged. By the end of the first term, I'd learnt more than the whole of the previous year. The first theory I feel is particularly relevant is the Socratic method. The Socratic method is written about in Plato's Theaetetus by the way of supporting his theory that all knowledge is innate and requires the right stimuli to be unlocked. The Socratic method was a technique used by Plato's teacher Socrates and involves evoking responses through a series of questions, essentially providing the correct stimuli for the student to access their innate knowledge. When we apply this to my anecdote, we can begin to understand the difference in results between Mr. Raven and Mr. Cork. Whilst Mr. Raven would only answer for the question, allowing me to learn nothing, Mr. Cork would begin with this question, and if it could not be answered, then he would begin to break down the question. Where might we start? What can you cancel out? And so on. Another thing the Socratic method encourages is discussion. Through these questions, other pupils were also able to voice aspects of the problem they were insecure with, allowing the class to come to terms with the maths problems better than they would have been able to without the validation of their struggles. Another good thing about the Socratic method is, whilst it seeks to teach students a correct answer, it does not make this the focus of its attention. In this sense, it does not make getting it right the sole objective, and thus allows students to feel comfortable getting the answers wrong as part of the learning process. An aspect of this is hearing others get the wrong answers. This normalized the situation for me and allowed me to understand sometimes it's okay to be wrong, it's okay to have room for improvement. This kind of learning environment is something Professor Nadaleris would likely have been an advocate of, considering his view of the value of failure in learning. Alaris claims the value and nature of the learning resulting closely related to the emotional dimension of the learning process. We were able to consider my ability to learn under the care of Mr. Raven was a result of my emotional incapacity to accept the option of failure, and therefore build my knowledge. Mr. Cork's sympathy and understanding of failure was on the other hand emotionally encouraging and produced a positive learning result. It is difficult to say whether a behaviourist approach to this method would support it, since While it has a lot in common with Socratic pedagogy, the two theories are ultimately irreconcilable. A behaviourist would primarily have issues with the popsicle method, based on the fact that it does not place enough importance on the value of correctness. It would have had a difficult time approaching the value of discussion in the classroom, since behaviourism is opposed to the discussion of any mental states, such as attempting to express or understand, or, as the case may be, not understanding. Behaviourism would value the responsibility the teacher holds in a Socratic pedagogian learning environment, since they both must react to and present stimuli in order to allow people to learn, something that behaviourists claim is the essence of the learning function of humans. Since, according to them, we act as machines responding systematically to stimuli in a certain way, like an input-output system. If a teacher can control the proverbial input, they can control the output. Ironically, behaviourist thinker Robert Slavin (1983 to 1985) was focused on the nature of the bond between the student and teacher. A strange thing but for a behaviourist to be interested in, since an emotional bond would be considered an internalized mental state. Slavin's interest may illuminate the natures of the problem and the solution for my mathematical education. With Mr. Raven, there was no bond or mutual understanding. He did not appreciate the problems I experienced. With Mr. Cork, however, the opposite was true, and I believe that this played a key role in my development of understanding his subject. One final thought to consider is the dangers of labelling. Mr. Raven labelled me as a failed pupil, and thereafter made an example of me to other pupils. In doing so, he made me label myself as a failure too, and from that point, the rest of the year might as well have been struck off. Irving Goffman considers the process of labeling alienates the labeled and essentially does not allow them to re-enter normal society until their label is removed. He also considers that labels are placed upon those who deviate from the norm, and their deviance is therefore relative to the norm. In my case, I was able to share my label for two reasons. Firstly, because that my label was removed from me by an external influence, Mr. Cork, and secondly, because my situation was normalized. In being normalized, I was no longer deviant from the norm. This process of labeling seriously affected my comfortability and happiness for an entire year, and serves as one of many examples of why, particularly as an authority figure in a learning environment, one must act with more care, responsibility, and acceptance. Questions must be asked for situations to be understood, and that is precisely why the Socratic method has stood up for years and will continue to do so for many more.